Can everybody hear me without a microphone, or do I need a microphone? If y'all need a microphone, just raise your hand. Excellent. Okay. I don't have to worry about that then. Usually my voice is first of all, I just want to say how wonderful it is to see everybody here today. This is going to be an awesome day for all of us. For those of us who have heard Vaneetha speak before, we know we're in for a special time today. For those who have not heard Vaneetha speak before, you are in for a special treat. Let me tell you a little bit about Vaneetha. She's a gifted writer, blogger, and obviously speaker. She lives here in Raleigh. She has 2 daughters. One's in college and one is in high school. She's a member of Christ Covenant Church here in Raleigh. She's the daughter of 2 of our church members, Rendall, and I don't think David's here this morning, but they're both founding members of our church, and Suku's here this morning, obviously. Most importantly, Vaneetha is a child of God and a sister in Christ. And I wanted to go on with a few other thoughts here. All of us have faced challenges. We will face challenges, as we saw here. We all have worries. Today, Vaneetha is going to share some of the challenges that she has endured and how God has strengthened and encouraged her, reminding us that no challenge is greater than our God. The God who created us, the God who provides for us, who comforts us, strengthens us, and who is with us all the days of our lives. So it is my pleasure at this time to introduce our speaker this morning, Vaneetha Rendall.
Wonderful to be here. It's great to see all of you. Well, Dave and I walked into the familiar doctor's office. It was a beautiful day and the sun was shining. As soon as we got there, the nurse took us back into the small ultrasound room. I looked at my husband and squeezed his hand. I was so excited. I was 20 weeks pregnant and couldn't wait to find out if I was having a boy or a girl. I got into the room, I glanced around and looked, and there was machines, there was an x-ray machine, a small table. There's nothing on the walls though, and I was wondering why, and while I was pondering that, the technician came in, and she was very bouncy and very excited, and she came in and said, "We're here to do your scan." And she started telling us all the organs in the baby's body, and we were sort of joking around with her, and then all of a sudden, she stopped. And I said, "Why aren't you telling us more? We can't wait to hear more about what you have to say." We started joking with her, and she just kind of went still. And she started looking at the monitor, and she didn't say a word. Then all of a sudden, she got up, and she walked out the door. And right before she closed the door, she said, "I'm going to have to send the doctor in. I'm so sorry." "I'm so sorry? What did that mean?" I had this horrible dread creep over my body, and I started shivering. I knew then something bad was about to happen, but I didn't know what. That felt like the longest 10 minutes of my life as we waited. I talked to Dave, I played with my gown, I looked around the room and wondered why they never put any pictures in there. When we had walked in, I was carefree and happy, and my biggest concern was whether the nursery needed to be in blue or in pink. But now that didn't matter at all. Well, Dave and I prayed together. We didn't know what was going to be before us, but we knew it was going to be hard. And we prayed that God would help us as the doctor walked in. I needed to sense God's presence. In an instant, life had changed. Everything was different now. Life had been going well. God was blessing me. And then all of a sudden, things felt uncertain. Maybe you felt that way before. Everything's going fine. Nothing in life is going particularly differently. And then all of a sudden, something happens and it turns your world upside down. It happens to most of us at some point in our life. And when it does, nothing feels safe. Maybe that you go to the doctor and you find that you have a lump in your breast. Or maybe your husband has a great job, and then all of a sudden, he's found out he's got laid off. And you've made some bad financial decisions, and then you don't know what you're going to do. Or maybe you have a child who you're very close to, and all of a sudden you're cleaning up his room, and you find drugs And in those moments, your whole world changes. Nothing is going to be the same. Well, that happened to people in the Bible too. It happened to Joseph, it happened to Job, and it happened to the Apostle Paul. Paul was a Pharisee. He was a very strong religious leader, and life was going well for him. He was a member of the tribe of Benjamin. He studied under Gamaliel. He was blameless in keeping the law. And he was rabid about ravaging the church. He wanted to persecute Christians because he was so sure they were wrong. But then one day, he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. He saw a blinding light, and the presence of God was before him. And that turned his world upside down. And he was, after that, he was called to preach to the Gentiles. But Paul was also called to suffer. So in an instant, Paul's world was turned upside down. Now, I think it's easy for us to gloss over Paul's sufferings because he was an apostle. I very rarely think about his sufferings of Paul. But he went through a lot. He had intense physical suffering. He went from town to town and had to sleep in the streets. He was almost homeless many times. He had to fear for his life. He poured out his life for people that didn't even care about him, for the most part. They made fun of his delivery. He was constantly traveling. And he had a thorn in the flesh. And we don't know what that is, but it was so big that he was constantly asking God to take it away. He was begging God to take it away. And I think a lot of us here have things in our lives that we are begging God to take away. But Paul found that his suffering was more than worth it. In Romans 8:18, he says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us." Nothing can compare with the glory that will be revealed to us. So our sufferings, as Paul sees it, pale in comparison to that glory. So what is that glory? We hear that phrase often, what the glory of God. And much of that glory we're going to see in heaven, and there's no more tears or crying or pain, and we will have unbroken fellowship with God. And we'll see God in a way that we've never seen him before. Well, Beth Moore has a definition of the glory of God that I really like. And she says God's glory is the way he makes himself recognizable. It's how he makes his attributes visible. So when we see the glory of God, we see God's attributes. It may be his justice, his faithfulness, his mercy, his love, his revelation in creation. All of those things will be visible in heaven. But at the same time, many of those things are visible on earth. So on earth, we get a glimpse of God's glory. The Bible often speaks of God's glory as the pillar of fire. His presence went with the people in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire that guided them. And the temple was filled with God's glory. It was filled with his presence. So to me, one of the most precious parts about God's glory is his presence. And that's what we long for on earth more than anything. Because I believe that God's presence is the greatest gift he can give us. Apart from our salvation, his presence is the very best present he can give us. And this verse that I just read contrasts God's suffering with God's presence. Suffering ushers in the very presence of God. Because we're desperate and we're needy, and we cry out to him in suffering. And often his presence can make us forget our suffering, maybe even just for a moment. The Bible talks about this slight and momentary affliction. Is preparing for us a weight of glory that is beyond all comparison. So I would paraphrase Romans 8:18 to say, our suffering can't even begin to compare with the gift of God's presence. Nothing can compare with God's presence. There's a joy in being with God that's greater than any suffering. Well, I can say this now with conviction, but as a child, I wanted nothing to do with God. Let me tell you my story. I was born in India to Christian parents. My mom is sitting right there. And when I was 3 months old, I got contracted polio. Polio is a disease that no one gets anymore because it's been eradicated for the most part. And even then, it was very unusual, so the doctors didn't know what I had. But I had a very high fever. I had 105-degree fever as an infant, so the doctors gave me cortisone to lower my temperature, but it also lowered my body's immune system. So within 24 hours, I was completely paralyzed. And then the doctor said, oh, I don't think she had typhoid, which is what they thought I had. She had polio. But by then, the damage was done. At the time, the doctor said that I would probably die, and if I didn't die, I would be in a wheelchair for the rest of my life. They told my parents the most that they could hope for was that I would be able to sit up. Well, my mom and dad were heartbroken, and they prayed, and my grandmother prayed, and they had circles of people praying for me. And so I showed a little improvement, but not much. And the doctor said, if you really want her to do any better, you need to go to the West, because the medicine there is much better. So my dad, who was a university professor in India, took a manual job installing telephones in England, just so that I could have good medical care. I had my first surgery in England when I was 2, and most of my operations were in Canada. By the time I was 13, I had 21 operations. Well, my earliest memories are of the hospital. I was in the Shriners Hospital, and I was there 3 months, almost every year it felt like, maybe it wasn't. But when I was 7, I was flat on my back in a body cast for 9 months. In this hospital I went to, my parents could not visit me every day, so they could only visit me on weekends. So I was there by myself. And most nights, I remember crying myself to sleep, wondering if my life would ever get any better. I lived on a ward with, I think, about 10 other girls, and that became my family. And it wasn't as nice as my real family. Well, when I was young, I just coped with the situation. I didn't know any different. But when I got older, I got angry. I was angry that this happened to me. I was angry that I was different from everyone else, and I was angry that a loving God would let this happen. People, when I was out of the hospital, actually, kids would make fun of me. They would laugh and point at me and imitate the way that I walked. And they would say, "What's wrong with you?" When I was 8 and just out of the hospital, a group of kids knocked me down and they threw stones at me, and they called me a cripple. That haunted me for years. The message that I took away was that I was different, and I would never be like everyone else. God didn't care. If he did, he would have healed me. Everybody else's life was perfect. Mine was a mistake. Well, I spent a lot of my childhood being angry, but looking pretty good on the outside. I went to church, and when I was in high school, I got involved in FCA. Now, that's Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Now, I am not an athlete, and I was not a Christian, but that didn't matter at all. I was at FCA because the popular crowd went, and specifically because all the cute boys in my high school went to FCA. And so a friend and I would sit in the back, and we would talk about boys. I didn't take the God stuff too seriously at all. Well, our junior year, she went away on a retreat, and she came back, and she said to me, "God is real." Well, I wasn't very happy about that, because I thought, oh no, we are not going to sit in the back and talk about boys. She's going to want to sit in the front and talk about God. And that didn't sound like a good idea to me. So I kept going to FCA and just kind of listening and wondering, is this even real? Do people really believe this stuff? Well, one night I was just lying in bed and I just said, okay, God, I've never believed in you. You've never done anything for me. But everybody else seems to think that there is something to you. So I'm just asking you, if you're real, show me. And I went to bed. The next morning I got up, and I wasn't really looking for an answer, but I thought, might as well, ask God again. So I said, God, are you real? And I picked up a Bible that I had gotten when I was confirmed in our church and was not a believer, and had actually shoved the Bible into the nightstand and thought, I'm never going to pick this up. But I picked it up, and I opened the Bible, and I said, okay, God, Now, I wouldn't recommend the arrogance that I had, but I had it. And I flipped the Bible open. I remember to something like Leviticus. And there was, don't boil a cat in its mother's milk. And I thought, okay. And then I went over to Chronicles, and there's a lot of names. And I thought, okay, the Bible has never meant anything to me. And then one last time I said, God, why did this all happen to me? How can you be good? And I flipped the Bible open to John 9, and I started reading. And it says, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man sinned nor his parents, Jesus said, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. This happened that the work of God might be displayed in his life. The disciples had been asking Jesus for a cause. I had been looking for a cause. All of my life, I wanted to see what caused this and what was to blame and why was I to blame. But Jesus answered his disciples with a purpose. And they are worlds apart. So many of us are looking for a cause. Who do we blame? And God is here to tell us what the purpose is. Well, when it dawned on me what I had read, I was stunned. It was as if the God of the universe had jumped off the pages of the Bible and was speaking directly to me. As I sat on my bed, the sun was streaming through my room, and God's presence just flooded my room. It was a moment I will never forget. A moment when God intersected my life and called me. All the pain and struggles I'd endured as a result of having polio were not to punish me. It was not because God didn't care, but it was because God could use them. God could be glorified through my life. My handicap was no accident. God created me for this. Well, I knelt down by the side of my bed and committed my life to a God I didn't know, but was certain knew me. For the first time at 16, God's presence was the best present. Well, I thought my testimony would be the opposite of Paul. He started off, his life was great, and then it became difficult after he met Christ. And I thought, well, mine's different. I've had my big suffering. I've met God. My life is going to be great. It's going to be easy. Well, things were going well for a while. I went away to college and worked for a while, went back to grad school, which is where I met my husband, Dave. And after a few years, we had our daughter, Katie. But I also had 4 miscarriages. And after the 3rd miscarriage, I was pregnant and went in for a routine 20-week ultrasound. And that's where my story began, at the beginning of my talk. That was the appointment that would change my world. After a horribly long wait, the doctor came in, and she did the scan again herself. And then she said, your son has a serious heart problem. It looks like he only has half a heart, but we'll have to do more tests. Well, we had more tests done and realized that was indeed the case, that he had half a heart. And so we realized we had some options, and one of them was to have surgery at birth. I had a good friend from high school who was a pediatric cardiologist, and he talked to us about the options and got us set up at the University of Michigan, which the doctor had the best track record in the country for this type of surgery. So Paul was born in August of 1997, and he had a surgery a few days after birth. I was at the University of Michigan Hospital, and he was doing really well. He was hooked up to lots of machines, but the surgery went well from the very beginning. And we were able to go home in record time. I was so happy about that. And I remember coming home and being so grateful that God had really done a miracle on what I thought in our baby's life. He was an adorable baby. He had a sunny disposition and sparkling eyes. He had curly black hair and chubby little legs. And he loved to be held. Now, my oldest daughter didn't really like to be held. She wanted to wriggle out pretty much the minute she was born. But this little one just loved being held. And so we held him all the time. Well, after surgery, I was being followed up by a local cardiologist in Raleigh. And he would refill our prescriptions and do our checkups. And when Paul was 7 weeks old, we took him in to the cardiologist. Well, the doctor was not there, and there was a substitute that day. But he said he knew everything about Paul's condition, and he was amazed at how well Paul was doing. Paul was happy and smiling, and he said, he's doing great. He said, I just think we need to take him off his medicine because, he's doing well. He doesn't need this anymore, and I think nowadays everyone over-medicates. So we were so happy. He said, I'm just going to give you a couple of prescriptions, and you can go home. I think we're out of the woods. So I was thrilled. Well, that night, late that night, I was talking to my friend John, the pediatric cardiologist, and he said, he did what? And I said, well, he took Paul off his medicine, and he said, he needs that medicine. He said, that guy did not know what he was talking about. And I said, well, what do I do? It's Friday night. I said, I don't even know who to go to. Like, do I go to the ER? And he said, well, and I was panicking, and he said, no, it's probably okay. I said, this is going to be a real pain. And so he said, yeah, I don't know if anybody would really know what Paul needs to be on anyway. He said, you're probably okay, but you need to go in. You need to call now, and you need to go in as soon as you can. And I said, oh, well, I will go in as soon as I can. Well, that was Friday, and Saturday we had a shower. We actually had 2 showers that weekend for Paul. Everybody was so happy to see this baby that they had prayed so long for. So our church shower was that day, and it was a great, great time. And Sunday night was the church shower. So I got home, and then the next morning, early in the morning, got up to nurse Paul in the middle of the night. Dave was holding him, and Paul screamed and went limp in Dave's arms. We called 911, and Dave went with him to the hospital. And I waited at home with Katie. And we called some friends over to come stay with Katie so I could go to the hospital. And while I was waiting, I called John. It was 3 in the morning or 2 in the morning, and I called him and I said, John, what do I do now? Paul's in the hospital. What do I need to tell the doctors? And John just said, I'm so sorry. And I said, okay, thank you. I'm glad you're sorry, but tell me what to do. And John just said, I'm so sorry. So I hung up the phone, and I got on my knees, and I begged God not to take the life of our son. But then at the same time, I asked God for the strength to help me make it through whatever was going to be before me. So our friends arrived, and I went to the hospital. Got to the hospital, and I was thinking, Paul's going to be hooked up to all those same kinds of machines that he had been in the ICU. But when I got to the front desk and explained who I was, the nurse said, I'm so sorry. And I said, okay, thank you, but can you show me where my son is? And then she realized I didn't know what she meant. And she said, I'm so sorry. Your son is dead. I went numb. I felt like I'd been kicked in the stomach. I felt like I couldn't breathe and I couldn't think. But I stumbled into the room where Paul had been treated. And he was lying on the bed to the table, and Dave was beside him. And I held his precious body in my arms for the last time. He was 2 months old. Well, I couldn't believe it. I thought we went through all of that, and Paul died because of a doctor's mistake? How could God allow that? How could that be part of God's plan? At the time, it made no sense, and I really wondered, where was God in all of this? Well, Paul died early Monday morning, and the next day was full of details and busyness, planning a funeral. So many people came to our house. Lots of people who just came to sit with us. Some people who had lost spouses or children. And that was so comforting to me, because when I saw them, I thought, you've made it through this. I can make it through. Well, Dave and I wanted our funeral for Paul to be uplifting, a testimony to God and a celebration of Paul's life, not a mourning of his death. We wanted to make sure that we honored God and that people would feel closer to God because Paul lived, and not angry with God that Paul died. I don't think I've ever felt closer to God as I did at Paul's funeral. But after the funeral, there was so much emptiness. just coming home, looking at Paul's bed, and realizing he was gone. I didn't want to get out of bed, and every day felt gray, and a heaviness settled over me. I went back and forth between trying to connect with God and pushing God away, because God didn't feel safe. Well, I remember listening to a worship tape, though, in the car, a few weeks after Paul died. I had been praying that God would help me because I felt so distant from God, and I wanted his presence and his comfort, but I didn't know how to get it. And I asked God, help me to feel your presence right now. Be real to me. Draw near to me. The next moment, I felt this overwhelming, inexplicable joy come over me that I cannot explain. It was like the presence of God filled my car. Every joy or sorrow I have ever felt paled in comparison to that. Indeed, one day in God's courts is worth 1,000 elsewhere. His presence was the best present. And I knew then, just knowing and praising God would be sufficient to meet my every need. I finally got it. Nothing in the world mattered as long as I had Jesus. Well, a few months after Paul died, I was talking to a friend of mine about Paul. She'd been new to our church and had brought us a meal and been to the funeral, but I didn't really know her. And so she wanted to talk more about him and about us. And we talked about the things that God had done in my life and how God had gotten me through it. Well, that friend, his name is Crystal Wells, and she's a songwriter. And she wrote the song Held, in which the first verse is about our son Paul. Now, I'm not sure how many of you listen to contemporary Christian music, but Held was recorded by Natalie Grant in 2006 and became a big hit. It was incredible how many people were touched by that song. Well, a few months after the song came out, I was in line at Brugger's Bagels getting a sandwich, and I was impatient as usual, and the song came on the radio, and I thought, oh God, thank you. It just sort of calmed me down, and it was not a Christian radio station, so I was like, wow, this is such a gift. The guy who was making my bagel stopped and listened to the song, and he started to tear up, and he said, hey, do you mind if I just wait a second while before I can make your sandwich, because this song has meant so much to me. He said, my mom died a few months ago, and my family wouldn't have made it through without this song. So I nodded, and I shared that moment with this stranger in the Brugger's, with the song streaming through the radio, realizing God uses everything. He uses our pain. And sometimes we get to see it, and we get to see how God is blessing other people through something we've been through. And sometimes we don't. That was a huge blessing in my life. And I saw just a sense, God, in that Brugger's, that knowing God, that being with God was the best present you could possibly have. Well, Paul died 17 years ago, and in some ways it seems like just yesterday. I can still picture his precious face. But in other ways, it feels like a million years ago. And the pain of losing him has become less intense, but the lessons I've learned about God have become stronger. I have seen more than ever that being with God is the very best thing in life, and nothing can compare with his presence. His presence is the best present. Now, I have to admit, I don't like suffering. I personally would not sign up for it. And I don't think anybody in here would. If you would, don't. But what it has done in my life would not have happened any other way. And that makes it worth it. Charles Spurgeon agrees. He says, there is no greater mercy that I know of on earth except good health. I'll start from the beginning. There's no greater mercy that I know on earth than good health, except it be sickness. And that has often been a greater mercy to me than health. It is a good thing to be without a trouble, but it is a better thing to have a trouble and know how to get grace enough to bear it. It is a better thing to have a trouble and to know how to get grace enough to bear it. Getting grace enough to bear it comes from running to Jesus, who bore it all for us. Well, I'm so thankful I learned how to get grace enough to bear my troubles by running to Jesus, because none of us ever know when troubles are going to show up again. And over 10 years ago, major trouble showed up in my life. Our family was visiting friends, and got in the car, pulled the seatbelt across, and I had this searing pain in my right arm. The pain was so bad, I couldn't buckle my seatbelt, I couldn't feed myself, I couldn't dress myself for probably a week. I couldn't figure out what it was. Went to doctors, and finally somebody said, this could be related to polio. And I thought, related to polio? I didn't really know how it could be, but I started researching it a little bit and realized I probably needed to go to a polio clinic. So I did. And when I was there, they diagnosed me with post-polio syndrome. So this pain in my arm was not going to go away. It was a result of an overuse injury. And post-polio syndrome, for those of you who don't know, is a degenerative condition which is characterized by pain and weakness. And basically, you have a limited amount of energy in your body. Just like when you get polio, you have these motor neurons. Everybody has motor neurons. When you get polio, your motor neurons die. But your body sprouts up secondary motor neurons, which is why you get to do things. I was a quadriplegic after I got polio, and then I was able to move my arms and legs. But they find that these secondary motor neurons have a limited life. They don't last forever. And they last about 30 to 40 years, and then they start to die. And then you just start going backwards. And so you have to really conserve your energy, because you have a certain amount of energy. I have a certain amount of energy, so everything that I do takes away from that. So they told me I needed to stop doing most of the things I was doing if I wanted to be able to feed myself. Now, the first thing I did was give up vacuuming, laundry, dishes. I handled all of that like a trooper. That was not very hard. I was more than anxious to think of more household chores that I could not do. But there were other things that were hard. Giving up my hobbies, because I couldn't waste energy to do things that weren't that important. I had to focus on the bare essentials. Well, I was utterly unprepared for this diagnosis. I was a wife and a mother of two. I didn't need to deal with this. It was unthinkable that I could be in a wheelchair, maybe soon. How could God do this to me? I was so frustrated. I thought, I've been faithful, God. I've been through a lot. I've suffered with a handicap my whole life, and I've learned to adjust. But how could I handle all of this? I used to love scrapbooking. I boxed up my scrapbooking supplies. I gave up painting and jewelry making. I canceled subscriptions to cooking magazines. Life had to be a lot more simple. But while these losses were hard, losing my independence was excruciating. I constantly had to ask for help to do things, simple things, that I wanted to do by myself. And it was slow and painful adjusting to all of these losses. Well, several years later, while I was just learning to adjust to all of these losses, my husband Dave came home and announced that he was leaving for someone else. I was shocked and shattered. That was unthinkable to me. And that announcement plunged me into the darkest time of my whole life. I didn't get out of bed for a week. I lost 10 pounds in 2 weeks because this loss felt so different from every other loss, because I was completely alone. There was no one to share this with me, and this was personal. This was a rejection of me, a rejection of our life, what I had spent almost 20 years building. At the time I was homeschooling my two daughters, and I had nowhere to go during the day. I would lock myself in the bathroom, often, or in the closet, and I would until I couldn't even breathe anymore. My heart was so closed and my dreams were so buried that I thought life would never be good again. This affected both of our daughters profoundly. Their father had left and their world had collapsed. They were 10 and 13 at the time, and our once peaceful home became a war zone, where anger was spilling out everywhere. I cried myself to sleep at night and woke up exhausted to face the day. And I yelled at God. I know that may sound unspiritual to some of you, and you might be appalled, but I would lie in bed and scream at God in the darkness. And I would say, why are you doing this to me? Why do you hate me? I honestly wanted to die. And I didn't care at that point if I was hit by a car or get cancer or just go to sleep and never wake up. And that went on for a while. We went through 3 years of painful back and forth, just trying to figure out what was going on with Dave. But then after that, filed for divorce. He wanted to get divorced, and 2.5 years ago, the divorce was finalized. Well, as I said earlier, that was the darkest time in my life. And in the middle of the night, one night, when I had been sort of screaming at God, as I had done several times before, the weight of life felt just like it was too much. And I had begun to feel very distant from God. I didn't want to draw closer to God. I didn't feel like I could trust him. But then in the darkness, I begged God to give me something to hold on to. And what I often do when I beg God to give me something is I open the Bible. So I opened the Bible and read several things, and then I read John 11. It was the story of Lazarus. Jesus intentionally delays his visit to see Lazarus when he hears that Lazarus is sick. He delays, and Lazarus dies. He delays because he loves their family. He delays because he wants them to see the glory of God. He says to Martha, if you believe, you will see the glory of God. So if you believe, God will make himself recognizable to you. I let the words of that sink in. God was speaking to me. He loved me enough not to rescue me. He had a bigger purpose for my suffering. So I sat with the Bible, tears streaming down my face, and the presence of the Lord filled my room. I was undone. It was almost more than I could take. I joined the Israelites who saw the glory of the Lord on the mountain, shrouded in black clouds and deep darkness. A glimpse of this glory, a glimpse of God's glory, overshadowed my suffering. And I realized I wanted Jesus more than I wanted relief. That really was a pivotal time in my life when God met me in the midst of my suffering. And as I sat in my little chair by my bed in the semi-darkness, I knew once again that God's presence was the best present. And even if my world fell apart, God had given me the greatest gift he could give him, and that was himself. But even after that amazing encounter, I don't want you to think that life became easy, because life was still painful, and I still struggled to get out of bed. But experiencing God that way reframed how I felt. There was this sweetness with walking with God. John Piper quotes Samuel Rutherford saying, "The great king keeps his finest wine in the cellar of affliction." The great king keeps his finest wine in the cellar of affliction. And Piper adds, he doesn't bring it out with chips on the veranda on sunny days. So there's an intimacy with God that we experience in the dark that we just don't experience on sunny days. Now I wonder how that quote feels to you. that the great King's finest wine is in the cellar of affliction. Because some of you may be wondering, I'm not in the cellar of affliction, but I want to feel God's finest wine. Can I do that? For some of you, life is going well, and you may be wondering if you can experience God's presence if you aren't suffering. It is a blessing that things are going well. Now, of course, we know that everyone will suffer sometime. It is inevitable. But in the meantime, do not ask for suffering or pain to know God more. Enjoy where you are. And everyone will have seasons of blessing and happiness. For some people, it's short-lived, and for others, it's the norm in their life. And I have to say, right now, that's where I am. I feel more blessed and happy than I think I've ever felt. I'm in love with an amazing man. He's sitting in the back, and I'm really excited about the future. Yeah, he's hiding. And, it's been a very long time since I felt this way. And in this, I see that God is restoring the years the locust has eaten. But I do want to say that God didn't owe me this. This is a gracious blessing. God would still be good if he didn't give me joy. I don't think we can feel like if we are faithful, our lives and our struggles will end with a bow. That's sort of the thing that the world says is, put in your time and it's all going to be tied up with a bow. And parts of our lives may have a bow, but all of it won't. But God does want us to be happy. He wants to give us joy. And so I'm in a season of great joy and great happiness. But much of my life, and I would suspect much of yours, is neither filled with intense suffering or wild joy. Most of us live in the in-between, just day-to-day life. And the question you may have after hearing most of my talk is, can we experience a rich walk with God in the day-to-day? And I think we can. But I need to be honest with you. I don't have as sharp and as tangible a sense of God's presence as I did when I was desperate. My experience with God is not exactly the same as in the struggle. And that is the exquisite blessing of suffering. But I still know God intimately. And I have to confess that sometimes I feel guilty now that I'm not struggling. I feel less spiritual. Because in much of my life, because it's been marked by suffering, I've equated pleasing God with suffering. And I've been praying about that a lot recently because that's really not the correct view of God. God wants to bless us, he wants to give us joy, and he wants to give us his presence. But we can have blessings and joy in his presence in good times and in bad times. He wants us more than anything to want his presence. So if you are in a season of just happiness, things are going well, enjoy them. But don't let them fully satisfy you. And this is what I've been praying about. Long for the deeper things of God that only he can fill. Ask him to make you passionate for him. Come with your needs. Be needy. I completely believe our capacity for God is carved out of our need. All of us have places in our lives where we feel empty. Don't fill those with other things. Fill them with God. The last few days, I've been asking God, how else do I experience your presence? How do I tell everyone here, how do we feel your presence when we're not suffering? And the answer I sensed was just time. And I know that's a very simple answer, but spend time with God. Don't be in a hurry. I think one of the reasons that we sense God's presence when things are hard is because we spend time with him, because we're desperate. But when things are good, we have other things to do. We see spending time with God as, oh, I just got to get that done. I got to check it off. And it feels like an obligation because there are other things we'd rather do. Whereas when we're suffering, there's really nothing else to do. So I'm not suggesting this in a legalistic way, like, put it on your calendar and spend hours with God or he's not going to be pleased with you, because that's a lie. God cannot love you any more than he does right now if you know Jesus. So it has nothing to do with whether God loves you, whether he's pleased with you, but it has everything to do with how you know God. Just like for anybody that you love, you don't say, well, I love you, and that's all I need to say. You want to spend time with somebody. You long to be with them. And it's not a duty. You don't say, okay, well, I have 20 minutes with you today, and then I'm going to be done. You can't wait to spend time with them. And I think that's how we grow when we're not suffering, is we say, God, make me needy. Because naturally, a lot of us don't desire to spend a lot of time with God when things are good. We like his blessings. So I would say, ask God, make me needy. Make me dependent. Show me where I need you. And make time to spend time with God. And I want to add, if you are not suffering right now, this is something I was talking to somebody the other day, don't be afraid. For those of you who life is going well, don't live in fear that all of a sudden this is going to come crashing down. It may be that tomorrow is going to be a hard day, but don't believe that God wants you miserable. He will be there with you in the midst of deep suffering, if that is what he calls you to do. He will give you the grace to go through whatever he calls you to do. And the deeper the suffering, the sweeter the fellowship. Now, some of you here are going through deep suffering, though, and you're not really feeling God's presence. Maybe you're in the cellar of affliction, and there is no wine to be found. And the only thing you are drinking feels like vinegar. Are you going through trials and God feels more distant than ever? Maybe your rebellious teenager doesn't even talk to you and your home life is miserable. Maybe you're divorced and your marriage is crumbling from betrayal or rejection or constantly fighting. Or maybe you're drowning in apathy or neglect. Or maybe you're single and you long to be married and no one has even noticed you. Or maybe you long to have children, and that's your heart's desire, and you haven't been able to do that. Or maybe you have a child who's being bullied or is depressed, or life isn't turning out the way that they had wanted. Or maybe you have major health problems, and you struggle with a body that is wasting away. Or maybe someone you love is deeply sick, or dying, or has recently died. Maybe the bills are piling up, and your home is in disrepair, and you wonder how you're going to make it. Maybe you're struggling in your career, and you're overworked and underpaid, and everyone is getting promoted ahead of you. Or maybe you just feel empty and spent from the restlessness of life. And God is a million miles away, and he isn't safe anymore. And you feel too weary to pray, and you're listening to this talk saying, that sounds great to experience God's presence, but how in the world do I get there? If that's you, I beg you to grab your Bible after this is over sometime, sit by yourself, and cry out to God earnestly. Confess that you feel distant and scared and angry. Surrender it all to him and sit with him, not just for 5 minutes, but long enough to be really still. And worship God, even when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it. Ask him to come near. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Call on him, and he will answer you. When you seek the Lord, you will find him, and he will be your shelter in the storms of life. And when you do, you will see that his presence is the best present. Well, for some of you here, none of this makes any sense. Not necessarily because you feel distant from God now, but because you've really never had a personal relationship with God. Maybe you enjoy hearing messages and hearing what other people say about Christ, but it really has never impacted your life. Maybe you feel empty and you don't know what to do with that. Well, if you don't know Jesus, I'd encourage you. I'd go so far as to say, I beg you to cry out to God. Ask him to show you if he's real. Tell him you want to know him. Ask him to draw near to you. He'll meet you there. He is the Lord of the universe. He died for you. And he alone holds the keys to life and death. So talk to me after my talk, or one of the leaders here, the pastors here. They would love to pray for you or with you. Because all of us want you to discover that his presence is the best present. Nothing in the world can compare with that. Well, I've spent a lot of this morning talking through my life, talking through times of really hard suffering, times when I have met God. And those times have forged my faith in many ways. I have met God in the midst of my shattered dreams. And I have discovered that God's presence is the best present. But I want to remind you that we can experience his presence anytime. It's just easier in suffering because we are more drawn to him then. It's similar to having a candle in a dark room. The darker the room is, the more we need the candle. The more we see our need for it, the more we're drawn to it. Because we can't see without the candle. And we can't do anything else unless we're near the candle. And that's what God's presence is like in suffering. We seek it out because we need it. And our attention is riveted on it. In a pitch black room, your attention is riveted on it. But you can contrast that same lit candle in a bright room, and it's easy to overlook it. There's nothing different about the candle, but we don't notice it. We're not drawn to it. Other things capture our attention. And so it takes effort to focus on it. And that's what I want to leave you with, is realizing you can be drawn to Christ. You have to focus on him. It's not just when you're suffering. God is the same. But our need for him changes. What we feel our need for him. So ask him, draw me to you. Show me that I need the light, even in a bright room. So for the Christian here, we can experience God's presence in any stage of our life, in suffering and in times of blessing. It really means we need to feel our need for him. Spend time with him. Carve out space for him. And when we do, we'll discover over and over again that Jesus is better than our dreams. Nothing can compare with walking with him. His presence is the best present. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, we just have a couple minutes. I didn't know if anybody had any questions. I'd be happy to answer them. If you don't. And the other thing is, I think we might play the song "Held" for those of you who haven't heard it. The song that Krista wrote, where the first verse is about our son Paul, because this song really talks about how God holds us in our suffering. He holds us all the time, but we really sense his holding us in our suffering. So but I did want to say, did anybody have any questions? No questions? Okay, great. So if you could play that.
Healing.